All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you again for joining us today, and welcome to OCCA's Lunch and Learn on writing AI prompts for community college leaders. This is an exciting topic as it deals with new technology of AI and how you can best use that in your work. So I'd like to start off by thanking the OCCA Member Services Committee for their work in bringing these lunch and learns to our community colleges. And I'd like to thank Brett Roulette. He is the Executive Director of External Affairs at Lane Community College, and he will be leading today's presentation. So without further ado, I'd like to pass things over to Brett and go ahead and get started.
All right. Thank you, Katie, and good afternoon, everyone. Let's see if I can get our technology going. All right. And Katie, can you give me thumbs up if we have the right view? Perfect. Thank you. Well, again, good afternoon, and thanks for being here today. My name's Brett Roulette. As Katie said, I'm the Executive Director of External Affairs for Lane Community College in Eugene. Um, Look at that. I even have technology to show that's who I am. In my role here at Lane over the years, I've overseen marketing, communications, government relations, obviously a lot of the external affairs work, printing and graphics, our website. And like many of you, I'm assuming since you're here today, I really like to look for ways for myself and for my teams to be more efficient while still producing high quality work. I am what I think folks would label an early adopter. I love trying out new technology. Some of you were at my workshop at the OCCA conference a couple of years ago when ChatGPT was still relatively new, and I think I was sharing stories about the first time I ever came across ChatGPT. I was on a work trip in DC, and I think I spent the entire night. I didn't sleep much. I was having it do simple tasks like writing haikus in French and poetry in Spanish, and just kind of trying to push it to the limit, at least what I thought was the limit at the time. But I have found really creative ways, I think, over the last few years to find ways for AI to support the work that I do and that our teams do here at the college on a regular basis. But what I've really found is that the tools are only as good as we allow them to be for us, right? That's pretty much the case with almost any tool. And if you don't maximize the ability of ChatGPT or Gemini or whatever AI tool you're using, you're going to get what I refer to as garbage in, garbage out. If you put in weak prompts into AI, you're going to get weak results. Same thing if you put clear, strong prompts in, you're going to get high quality output. And so for about the next half hour or so, we're going to look at what you can do to help create and write stronger prompts for when you're using AI. Some of you may use a lot of these techniques already, so that may be more of a refresher for you. But in conversations with the Member Services Committee in OCCA, we kind of thought that before we moved on to a more advanced level, such as building AI GPTs to help assist with your everyday work, we should probably start with how you write strong, good prompts, because that's really the foundation that everything else is built upon. One thing I should kind of give a plug for at the beginning here today, my examples are based off ChatGPT, but you can use these techniques with any of the language models out there. There is a difference between paid and unpaid. I am a big advocate for, if you're going to use AI on a regular basis, throw down the $20 a month or equivalent for what it costs to have a subscription. There's a few good reasons for that. One, most of the companies that have AI agree that if you are a subscriber, they're not going to use the content that you submit on a regular basis to train future models. So in a way, it keeps your information private. And it also learns. So The longer that you use a particular model, the more content you share with it, the more effective it's going to be and helpful. And you can even train it to, when it's producing scripts and output, to talk and sound more like you, if that's the desired goal. Or if you're writing content for, say, a boss, a board member, a college president, and you share a bunch of previous speeches and content from those individuals, you can actually train AI to produce output that sounds like those individuals. The last thing I always like to kind of to say before I dive too much into AI is a little warning about confidential information. Um, AI is a great tool. It's not meant for everything. And if you're using just a standard, say, ChatGPT license, be careful about what you share. You don't, if you're working on a very top secret most of us aren't in this situation, but if you're working on, say, like a top secret press release for something that you don't want the rest of the world to know about, sharing it with an AI model might not be the way to go about that. There's other ways that you can help it with your tasks, but we can talk more about that later if you'd like. That's just always a warning I like to give at the beginning of a presentation. Okay, so prompts. Why does this matter in our everyday work? Kind of, as I've already said, these are super powerful tools, but they're only as good as we make them. Um, the reality is the better prompts we can come up with and put into an AI model, the better responses we're going to get. Better input equals better output. Um, and last, whether you're drafting communications or preparing reports, these tools can either save you time or they can create more work depending on how you go at it. Oftentimes, it may seem like a larger prompt at the beginning is more work, but what you'll find is if you develop the stronger prompts in the beginning of your work, it's going to save you a lot more time down the road. So I had to, for this slide, ask AI to generate a poster based off of the old Uncle Sam posters. Uncle Sam needs you. I had it come up with a poster of AI, what AI needs from you. Um, and really, it helps to understand, right? How does AI actually work? Because once you have an understanding that it's not just a robot that has sat down and learned everything. In an example I gave at the OCCA conference a couple of years ago, I used that. There was a movie in the 80s that I fell in love with as a kid. Short Circuit was about a robot that escaped and it sat in an apartment for a few months and read every book, watched every TV show, and basically learned as much as it could. And so when AI first came out, I thought, well, maybe that's how this all works. And really it doesn't. I mean, what AI does is it predicts patterns. It doesn't actually think. And so it's trying to determine when you ask a sentence, what is the likelihood based on the words that you have in your sentence for a response? It's a very big math problem. So in order to actually be productive for you, AI needs context. It needs to know what audience it's talking to, and it needs to know direction. By itself, AI doesn't understand much at all about our our specific institutions. It doesn't know the audience that we want to reach, and it doesn't know the goals of what we're trying to do unless we share that with it. In order to be effective, really, oops, let's try this again. Okay. So in order to be effective, AI really needs three key things from us. And that's not going to work, but we're struggling with my technology here. I think it's these admits in the waiting room, Katie. Sorry about that. Okay. So really to understand then what what makes a good prompt and a weak prompt, we should look at kind of the components of both. And you see here on the left, um, it's kind of when we first start using AI, what a lot of us default to. Weak prompts tend to be vague, something like write a paragraph about enrollment or summarize this. There's no real detail in the instructions that we're giving the GPT. It usually doesn't, we don't define an audience in the beginning, so AI doesn't know, is it writing for students? Is it writing for faculty? Is it writing for a board of education? If we don't give it a clear purpose, it doesn't really actually know what it's supposed to do to accomplish anything. And if we don't specify tone, format, or length, the output can be all over the place. And so a lot of the times, folks are using AI, they might treat it like a search engine, just putting in a quick request and expecting a polished result. Or they might just be using it for kind of a one-off, give a prompt with no real expectation to do any refinement once you get that first response. So now, if we compare, what makes a weak prompt to what makes a stronger prompt, you can see here on the right, a strong prompt is specific, it's detailed, it gives the AI something to work with. It's clearly defined an audience because, that basically shapes pretty much everything about how the response is going to be written. It states the goal, so AI knows what success looks like. It includes tone, whether it's going to be a professional, conversational, friendly, or encouraging mood. It tells the AI what format to use, whether we want a response that can be used as in an email, whether you're looking for a bulleted list or a short summary, and even how long you want it to be. That's super helpful if you're writing, say, like a letter to the editor in the newspaper and you want help making something fit within 150 words. That's kind of something that a lot of us in communications have struggled with for years. And now AI can help us summarize and condense information in just a few seconds. And lastly, one of the most important things that we can do is assign a role to AI. So tell it, for instance, act as a marketing professional or act as an advisor or analyst so that it knows kind of how you want it to view and come at the information. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about why the components of the prompts matter. Next, this is a framework that I've used to kind of help me when I look at writing prompts to make sure that I have all the components that I need when I write something for AI. It's called the CLEAR framework. I didn't make this up myself. It's called the CLEAR framework because the goal is simple, and that's because you want to make the prompts clear enough for AI that it can actually help you and get you what you're looking for. Okay, so the first one obviously starts with C, it's context. And that's, what's the situation that we're trying to do? AI is not going to know unless you tell it. And oftentimes we get generic feedback from AI because at the end of the day, AI is trying to make us happy. It's trying to give us as much information as it can, and really it wants to please us. But it's going to make a guess on a lot of these if we don't fill in the blanks for it. So context is simply answering the question, what's the situation? What task are we working on? So instead of saying something like, write an email about enrollment, you might say something more like, write an email promoting fall enrollment at Chemeketa Community College. And that at least gives AI a starting point. And so the more context you give it, the less guessing it has to do, and the results are going to be a lot better. Oops. Did you get that on your screen, Katie? Okay, are we good? Perfect. Next up is length and format. Uh, if you don't specify the length that you're looking for your final output, you're oftentimes going to get something that's either too long or too short or the wrong structure. So, think about what are you looking for here as a product? Do you want it to be a 150 word email? Do you want it to be a bulleted list? Do you want it to be a one paragraph executive summary, or do you want it to be a social media post? Make sure that's in your instructions. You're essentially saying, don't just give me content. You want it to be usable. E is expectations. And this is really about what the goal is we're trying to accomplish. So are you encouraging enrollment? Are you informing a board? Are you trying to simplify something that's complex? Without this, like I said earlier, the AI is going to give us something generic to fill in this space. But if you tell it what you're hoping to accomplish and you fill in the expectations, you let it be a little bit more powerful of a tool. So instead of saying write about financial aid, you're going to say something like explain financial aid in a way that helps students understand the steps to apply for it at Lynn Benton Community College. Next is the audience. Obviously, this is a big one. Who is this for? And because a message is going to sound a lot different if it's written for students or faculty, board members or legislators or community partners. If you skip this step, you're going to get a very generic tone. It's kind of that the AI voice that you can oftentimes pick up on if someone has used AI to write an email or send you something, and you can tell instantly if it was written by AI. And that's because we haven't fine-tuned who the audience is and given the AI that understanding. So, for example, just say things like act as a community college marketing professional, act as an institutional research analyst, or act as a financial aid advisor. That really tells AI who it is when it's helping produce this information for you. By doing so, you're going to help fine-tune tone, perspective, and level of detail. Sorry, and I went right into role here in my notes. Well, um, role is, telling it who it is, like I was just saying. So that it is the financial aid advisor, it is a community college marketing professional. And so there you have it. Have a lot more appreciation for faculty who teach online all of the time. This is the first 100% online workshop I've ever done. So thanks for bearing with me as technology seems to be fighting me on this end. But so there you have it. What I refer to as the clear framework. When you put all of this together, these are the components for building really strong prompts. Um, you can turn something like write an email about enrollment into something much more effective, like act as a community college marketing professional, write a 150-word email to prospective adult learners encouraging fall enrollment, emphasize flexibility and affordability, and use a supportive tone. I mean, right there, that is so much more guidance that you're providing for an output than just saying write an email about fall enrollment. Um, it may seem, like I said earlier, this may seem like a lot more work at the front end, but as you start to do it more often, it kind of becomes second nature. And you'll realize that it's saving you a lot more time on the back end. And the results that you'll get are going to be far superior than when you didn't fill in all of these components. Okay, so I have 4 quick examples to just kind of demonstrate the difference between weak prompts, strong prompts, and kind of from different populations that we serve. The first one is an example of an enrollment email, like I just mentioned. So let's walk through kind of to see how it plays out, and we'll start with that typical weak prompt. Write an email about fall enrollment, and that's it. It's short. It's very common. And we're going to see now how ChatGPT responds to us when we ask it to do that. So write about an email about fall enrollment. Come on, technology. All right. So, I mean, there you go. To be fair, this email, it's not bad. It's grammatically correct. It's professional. It's usable in a very general sense, but it's also incredibly generic. It reads like something that could come from any college. Obviously, we didn't tell it was writing for Umpqua Community College, did we? So it sounds very generic. It could go to any group of students at any time, and that's really the issue. It's relatively generic and not as good of an output as it could be. So using what we kind of just discussed earlier about a strong prompt versus a weak prompt, here is that example that we talked about with acting as a marketing professional, writing a 150-word email to adult learners encouraging fall enrollment, emphasize flexibility, affordability, and career advancement. All right. Okay, so now we're back here to ChatGPT. We're going to enter in that prompt and let's see the difference between the first one and this one. There you go. And immediately you can kind of see the difference between the first one and this one. This email is much more targeted. It's more engaging. It's arguably it's more persuasive. It's speaking directly to adult learners. It acknowledges their reality, work, family, competing priorities. It highlights what matters to the audience, flexibility, affordability, career advancement, and it has a much stronger sense of purpose. It's not just informing, it also kind of gives that motivational push at the end. And we could definitely tune this, right? We could include dates for different enrollment deadlines at, say, Lane Community College, so that the population knows then how soon they have to get registered. So, if you compare the two, the first one was very generic, it was safe, it was broad, but the second one much more focused, intentional, and audience specific. So again, same tool, and really the only difference is the prompts that we gave it. All right. For our next example, we're going to look at a board communication about enrollment at the college. Some of us regularly have to produce content for board packets. And so we'll start with something very simple and, summarize enrollment trends. Pretty straightforward. Again, this is how a lot of people start when they first start working with language models like this and first start writing prompts. We'll go back to ChatGPT here. We'll enter in that prompt, summarize enrollment trends. And just like, there we go. Just like the first one, right? There's nothing really wrong about the answer here. Pretty much spot on. It hits the pandemic decline, adult learner disruption, um, modest recovery and enrollment for many of us, shifts towards workplace programs. It's a lot of the information, again, it's accurate and correct, but this isn't really the information that our boards probably need or would find helpful. It's super generic. It's not specific to any of our institutions. So it's pretty much looking at community colleges nationwide. And really that comes back to the prompt that we give it. So what's missing from this? We haven't given it an audience. We didn't specify a format. We didn't give it a purpose. Like, is this for decision making, or is this for awareness? Is there a strategy? And we didn't provide context. So it's pulling from its general knowledge instead of, say, specific knowledge that it has for Oregon or for our institutions. So now, if we go back and we try to strengthen that, and we write a little bit stronger of a prompt, for example, act as an institution research analyst, write a concise executive summary with bullet points for a board of education. All right. Put in that prompt. All right. So immediately it's a little closer to what I think a board would expect. Um, it's structured. It's kind of like an executive summary. We got the bullet points, but it's still very, very much based on general trends. It feels like something that we could drop into a reporter presentation, but again, it's stronger, but it's still missing that, say, component of being specific to Lane Community College. So now we have a strong prompt. The one thing that we could add to make it even stronger would be some information about enrollment, right? And let's give it some information about enrollment at Lane Community College. And so I'm going to take an Excel spreadsheet. This is a report that we get once a week at the college. There's a line graph here, but Also, we have a list of enrollments for each program at the college. It's just a spreadsheet. There's no analysis done in the Excel spreadsheet. But what we're going to do is take that strong prompt that we just had it provide the last answer for, and combine it with this detailed enrollment information for Lane Community College. This is 2 weeks before winter term, this past winter term. Okay, so same thing. We're going to type the prompt in the space just like the last time, but then there's also the little plus sign. If you haven't added documents to ChatGPT or to AI before, you're able to go on and attach the Excel document as an attachment. And this is going to take a little bit more time because it's analyzing the document. It says unable to display visualization. That's the line graph that we were able to see in that Excel document. That doesn't show up immediately in ChatGPT. And you'll see it takes about 20 seconds or so to analyze all of the numbers in that spreadsheet. Still, though, 20 seconds is a lot quicker than I'm able to analyze that entire spreadsheet. And here you can see, I mean, it goes over overall growth year over year, total head count, new students, returning students, continuing students. This is all much more specific. And this is going to be a lot more helpful for, say, our Board of Education members or for folks on campus to have a good sense about what enrollment is currently like at Lane Community College. We're seeing specific numbers, year over year comparisons, breakdown by student type, like I said, short-term trends. It has a bullet point there for strategic implications. It's no longer super generic information. It's tailored, it's relevant, and it's actionable. Okay. Uh, Next example, and something that I rely on quite often, is using ChatGPT to simplify information. An example here, obviously a weak prompt, explain financial aid policy. This is something that we probably have to do regularly for prospective students or current students. But a weak prompt, similar to our other weak prompts, is going to provide a very generic response. Again, a lot of correct information. See a breakdown, the types of aid, what is satisfactory academic progress. It walks you through eligibility, enrollment rules. So obviously from a technical standpoint, it's a solid explanation, but probably the main issue here is this wasn't really written for students. We didn't define an audience. For many students, especially say first generation students, they may find some of this, the way it's written, a little overwhelming. So, we could define an audience. We could help define tone guidance so that it doesn't just default to something formal and kind of institutional. And we could give it a goal so that it knows what we're trying to ask it to do. So let's look at just kind of making a few adjustments. Strong prompt. Act as a financial aid advisor. Explain eligibility in plain language for first generation students in under 120 words. All right. So immediately you can see a pretty big difference between the last one and this one. This version is much shorter, it's clearer. It uses plain language that I think students relate to. It focuses on what students need to get started. It even, it's 120 words, so there's not much to work with, but it even throws in a little bit of encouragement at the end, which, when you're reaching out to a population of first generation students, that's probably something important to include. So, when you compare the two of them here, the first version, obviously it was more comprehensive, technical, policy focused. The second version, because we told it the audience and gave it a lot more of the clear framework. It's accessible, student-centered, action-oriented. So again, it was the prompt that made the big difference. It wasn't the tool that we're using. And one final, oops, one final example here. We'll skip right to a strong prompt on this because I think folks are starting to get the back and forth here between a weak prompt and a strong prompt. In my day-to-day work as government relations staff, Oregon legislation, it's great that Oregon has a state law that all of the bills that come out of Salem have to be written so that regular citizens can read them. I believe it's at a sixth grade reading level. Unfortunately, Washington, D.C. does not have the same rule. And so if you've ever sat down with some federal legislation at home at night, maybe because you can't sleep, I'm not sure, but if you've ever tried to read through some federal legislation, it can be pretty complex. And sometimes there's a reason for that. A congressperson from New Mexico might want something for their vote in order to vote yes, so they get something tucked into that bill. Same with someone from New York. And so before you know it, a farm bill might have some defense contract information and might have some firefighting funds tucked into it. In Oregon, bills can only have to be strictly focused on what the relating to clause at the top of the bill says it has to be focused on. So that could be relating to higher education. So when I am trying to look at federal legislation, I may develop a prompt such as act as a government relations professional, explain the impact of the attached federal legislation. In this case, we're going to attach HR 1, which was the big bill that was passed last July 4th in DC. But we wanted to explain the impact of HR 1 on community colleges for members of community college boards of education. And so again, we're going to go and put our prompt in to ChatGPT. We're going to click on the plus sign, and I'm just adding a PDF document of that 400-page federal legislation. And in that giant bill, there's not a lot that impacts community colleges, but in less than 10 seconds here, ChatGPT is going to read through that entire bill. And nice thing is when it's thinking, sometimes it gives you notes on what it's doing and it's saying it's going to try to focus this for board members, what's changing, what matters operational and financially. So it's still reading through the document. And here we go. It thought for 17 seconds, and here's a board level summary. And you can see just the detail that it gives. Obviously, the biggest opportunity, the law created Workforce Pell. It talks a little bit about Workforce Pell. It's providing links to HR 1 so that you can go into that document and find specifically in the legislation where this is coming from. There's questions here what board members should ask. For example, which short-term certificates would qualify for Workforce Pell? And so as you can see, by defining the audience, letting it know what our goal was, and being very specific in our prompt, this is a much better output than we would have gotten than if I would have, say, just attached the bill and said, provide a summary of HR 1. And so you just kind of have to take a few more seconds to have a more thought out prompt, and you're going to get a lot better of a response. All right, so some common mistakes. Obviously, now that we've seen multiple examples and we've looked at the framework, obviously the first mistake that a lot of folks make is just being too vague. Second common issue, people might write something like write something about or summarize this and just leave it at that point. And that's real easy to do, especially if you say have a really long news article and you just want a summary of it. But if you give it context, like summarize it for me as a community college administrator or as a foundation board member, it will try to look for anything in the document that might be of more interest to you than, say, the general public. Not defining your audience, no clear goal or outcome, no format or length specified. Again, not defining a role. Sometimes asking for too much at once. AI is really built to be refined. And so, going in knowing that it might take two or three or four rounds of back and forth before you can get a really good final product, that's something that you should just plan on. Sometimes, like I said earlier, people will treat AI as a search engine. Um, and then again, no iteration or trying to fine tune your document, shorten it or make it clearer. And that's really, necessary if we don't want it to sound like that AI voice we talked about earlier. Hallucinations. This was an interesting slide to be working on here at work. I'm sure most folks have heard about hallucinations. It's probably one of the biggest flaws of AI, things that we kind of have to know about. Um, what are hallucinations? It's when AI generates responses that are incorrect, misleading, or fabricated. And the thing about AI is it will give you that incorrect information in a very confident sounding way. And one of the things that I thought was most interesting when I first started doing research on AI was a study a couple years back where about half of Americans preferred incorrect information being given to them over AI as long as it was delivered in a very confident manner, which and we've seen this. There have been surveys done of people getting medical advice from AI, and it's been incorrect. But because it's been given in a very confident manner, people have accepted that information, and sometimes it's actually resulted in some pretty bad outcomes. Why does this happen? Well, as I mentioned earlier, AI really just wants to make us happy. It's predicting patterns. It's not verifying facts. And if it doesn't have all the information it needs, it's going to fill those gaps in when it's lacking the information that it doesn't have. And so the models are trained on really broad data, but they're not trained on, say, our institution specific data. And so it's always going to fall back to that general information that it was built off of, and it wants to make us happy. So it's just going to confidently give us what it thinks is a good answer. But oftentimes if you just accept everything as is and you don't do your homework and kind of proof it, it can result in things like, say, sending out a press release with incorrect information or sending a boss up on a stage with a speech that might have some incorrect information in it. So, how do you identify when hallucinations happen? I mean, sometimes you just have to look for things that sound too certain without any sources referenced. Most of the AI platforms, there's the ability for you to either turn on or off a setting to have links to sources included when it's giving you information. If there are specific details you can't verify within a response that you've been given, such as dates, numbers, or policies, you might want to question it, look for any inconsistencies or contradictions and things that maybe just don't match your institutional knowledge. Uh, don't be afraid to challenge AI. Verify important facts before you use them. If you see something in a response that's questionable, ask ask the AI you're using, where's the source of that information? Um, Ask it to provide the context and source material when possible. Um, and like I said earlier, use AI as a tool for drafting, not necessarily as the final authority. Okay, so we're about to wrap up. Key takeaways, obviously, be specific, define your audience, state the goal, give AI a role, take your time to refine results, use the clear framework. And I'm going to leave you with some homework because, right, this is college. Uh, Hopefully, you've all experimented a little bit with AI in the past. If you don't use it regularly, try to come up with one task that you've used it for and a prompt that you've put in and rewrite the prompt using the clear framework. Add context, define your audience, be clear about your goal, and just kind of see what happens. Compare with what you had been getting with once you've fine-tuned your prompts, how it works for you. And I guess that's all I have for today. The hope for this was that if folks enjoyed it and got something out of it, that we would use this as kind of the foundation for some additional AI workshops. We were going to look at things like building GPTs and doing a little bit more advanced work, but we wanted to make sure before we moved in that direction, folks had all of the tools for kind of the having good foundations, whether it's just basic prompts that you're working for or whether you're developing GPTs. You want to make sure that your prompts are written correctly for that. So hopefully this was useful. My contact information is provided here. If you'd like to reach out, please do so. Uh, I'm hoping that next time we have a lot of great instructors at the college here, and so many of them are starting to teach AI in the classroom. So there might be less of administrators like me doing these workshops and more with some of our great faculty. But this has been something that I have really enjoyed kind of getting to learn since the technology first came out. I publish a weekly newsletter that I think many of you are subscribers to, but it's a government relations newsletter, and it provides kind of summaries as to what's going on in the news, both at the local, state, and federal levels. And it's something that used to take me quite a bit of work, but now I have GPTs set up with really strong prompts, and it will actually go out and find the top 5 community college stories in Oregon each week and help pretty much produce the newsletter for me. So a task that used to take hours and hours to kind of do is now something that can be done each week in less than an hour. So it doesn't mean that I've turned it all over to AI. I definitely proof each issue before it goes out, and if anything looks off to me, I will check to make sure it's correct. But what it really has done is it's made it easier for me, where I used to kind of look at all of the local city councils in our district that were meeting each week to see what was on their agenda. Now I can rely on GPT to go and review all of that content and provide summaries for me. So then if there's a topic that is of interest that I think we should be following more closely, then I can go straight to that meeting packet. But I don't have to go through 10 meeting packets to look for stuff before I know. So I will end there. I really appreciate Katie and the Member Services Committee for letting us do this today, and hopefully, like I said, hopefully you all got something out of it. Um, Katie, I'll turn it back over to you, I guess, and happy to do questions if folks have any questions.
Yeah, I was just going to ask if anybody has any questions for Brett. It looks like we got one. Brett, Theo?
Yeah, Theo.
Hey, Brett. Hey, I was wondering, should we buy a subscription to an AI platform? You think it's good enough that we should do that?
Yeah, and I'll share a couple things to think about. Um, they're super valuable and affordable. At work, we in the marketing and communications team, we have a team account. Excuse me. We have a team account, and what that allows us to do is if I create a GPT, um, basically a tool in ChatGPT, I can share it with other members of my team, and we can share some of the chats that we may be working on with one another. You can also set them up as a solo account. Average cost is usually about $20 to $25 a month, so it's incredibly affordable. The amount of efficiency that it has given me in my work, it more than pays for itself. The one thing I'll kind of a seed I'll plant to let you think about is um, when you set it up as there's a couple challenges you set it up as a work account, right? Which, if you're using this for work, it is something that can be requested through a public records request. So you do have chat histories and things like that could be requested. Um, but at the same time, if you are only using a work account and then you go to take another job in, say, 5 or 10 years, all of that information that the GPT has learned about you is not going to transfer forward. So if you are using it a lot in your personal life, you may want to think about having a separate personal account and using it for your personal information separately than your work information. But I'm a strong advocate for looking for ways to kind of use this as a tool in the workday. it's kind of become kind of like email or the internet. It's just another tool that I use every single day in my work. And I've seen a couple of the chats. Claude, I agree. Claude is amazing. It has really recently, I think, probably pulled in front of ChatGPT. They all really have specifics that they're good in. Some are really good at creating graphics. Um, some people notice it, but in my weekly government relations newsletter, there's a graphic at the top. It has the title of the newsletter, but I actually have it change scenery. Sometimes it might be a view of the Oregon Capitol. Sometimes it's the national Capitol. If it's the spring, I'll make sure in the prompts that the cherry blossoms are blooming in the picture and things like that. It's also, it was able to put Mount Hood and a river behind the Oregon Capitol, which there's really no way you can see that in real life. But you know, there are good sites online where you can see what kind of the strong points of each different AI are, whether it's Claude or Perplexity or ChatGPT or Gemini. It's really about finding which one works best for you. And sometimes what works best in your home life might be different than what you'll want to use in the workday. Uh, let's see. How much should leaders and marketing professionals consider how the use of generative AI can lead recipients of the messages to turn away from the institution and can sour due to the ethical implications associated with generative AI? I think it's a good question. I didn't want to dive too much into the ethics of AI today. And obviously, Blaine Community College, where I work, one of our core values is sustainability. And so a lot of folks have a challenge with, there is an environmental impact of AI at the moment. Um, I think there's a lot of hope in the tech world that AI is actually going to help try to find solutions for that environmental impact. We've seen, out of China, in some of the lead AI platforms that they're building over there, they consume a fraction of the power of some of the American models that have been made. So I don't have a great answer for that. I think the goal would be if your prompts are written in a really good, strong format, the person on the other end shouldn't know that you're using AI to develop the information. Um, AI has been used in our daily lives for a while now. A lot of people don't even realize it, but when you're watching Netflix or streaming movies at home and you get to the end and it's suggesting what to watch next, that's a very early kind of version of AI. Or if you're listening to Spotify or Apple Music and it's suggesting new music, that's AI. So a lot of people are using it in everyday life and probably don't even realize it. You can download your chats from one GPT and import to another. I don't know about that. I haven't checked for a little bit. The last time I looked, I don't believe you were able to take from, say, like a work Teams account in ChatGPT and move it all to a personal. Um, but I think that's something that as folks are using it longer and longer, they're going to have to come up with a system to move that information. And that is, I didn't really mention that earlier, other than say that with the paid accounts, the platforms are able to learn from you and help get better with time. Um, it does kind of retain all of your previous chats. So if I am working with students for a project on campus, and we have a GPT going on, and then the next year rolls around, and I'm like, I would really like to go back to that. You can search in your GPT for previous chats and go back and find that. That's super helpful, and that's something that you don't always have with the free subscriptions. Um, has anyone used the Perplexity suite? I haven't used the suite. I have used Perplexity though. Chelsea.
Thank you. Uh, I sit on a lot of hiring committees. I just want to use an example of how it worked really well for me. And we had 85 applicants that met all min quals. And so I didn't know how I was going to do that. And I asked Claude to create a rubric. And I essentially was able to create, it saved me a lot of time. It still was somewhat time heavy, but I was able to upload every applicant's resume and score it against the rubric and come up with a really non-biased way to come up with the top 10 based on the criteria developed by the committee. And it turned in, what would have been a week's worth of work into like a day's worth of work. So I just wanted to share that. And then I recently did I'm working on a project around shared governance, and I was able to upload our organization's organizational charts to do a deep dive to comparison to the way that our organization sits against what a true shared governance model looks like. And that also was an amazing experience. And between those two things, it blew my mind. And now I'm completely like, this is going to save so much time. It's a matter of if you can conceive it, it can be done, I think. So it was great. I just wanted to
Yeah,
share.
no. Thanks for sharing. I've used it to check my scoring when I do RFPs. I'll go through and grade everything for say like a first round, and then I'll have GPT go through with the same grading criteria and put everything in, and I'll just kind of check myself to see were my scores close to what and hopefully a less bias
Yeah.
response would be. And so it's really good to kind of use it to check yourself like that.
Yeah. I was the only one on the committee that did it. And I just checked myself against the other four committee members, and that was a good exercise. So yeah, thank you, Brett.
Yeah, thank you. And someone asked if I'll be sharing the slides. Uh, I will. I'll share the slides with Katie because we had some of the GPT videos in there. It's kind of a big deck, but we can make sure you have access to all of that. And again, the video from today will also be available. So if you have folks that want to watch this that weren't able to join us today, it'll be on the OCCA Lunch and Learn website.
Yeah, thanks again, Brett. Yeah, I think that was kind of my closing, my wrap up if to share with folks if you want. And then so thank you, Brett, for today. I think it's very timely. Things are changing all the time in the AI world. I think it would make sense to look at, a 102 level next time and keep building on this. I think it is useful for folks at the college. And yeah, just thank you for your time and thank you all for joining. We'll be announcing our May Lunch and Learn next week, so keep an eye out for that email and hope to see you at a future Lunch and Learn. Thanks, everybody. Good day.
Thanks, everyone.